2023, without a doubt, has been a great year for fans of video game horror. It started off with the absolute blast that was Dead Space Remake, which successfully recaptured the sci-fi brand of Lovecraftian cosmic terror that the original had, which only increased your immersion into the character of Isaac Clarke, while traversing the harrowing mechanical intestines of Yuichi Ishimura. Then came the time for handsome boy Leon Scott Kennedy to have a glow-up too, in the form of the newest reimagining of the original Resident Evil 4, which finally managed to roundhouse kick its way into my cold-ass heart and make me accept that I've been too harsh of a critic of that title in the past. It can't be denied that these two behemoths of the survival horror genre are the prime reason for why so many have declared this year to be both the year of the remakes as well as the year of the big budget horror finally making it back into the video game mainstream. However, these are not the horror games that made the biggest impact on me this year. That title would belong to 3 different games. Games coming from studios both well known for the impact they had on the genre across the last 2 decades, as well as studios that are only taking their first steps into becoming the horror greats of tomorrow. Moreover, these games are actually nothing like each other, and only the first is easily recognizable as a clear representative of the genre in the contemporary sense of the word. Meanwhile, the last one might be considered as far removed from it as possible. Because of that, even if I wasn't on board with some of their design decisions, and at times I've been disappointed with some aspects of these titles, I can still easily recommend you play these 3 after watching this video to make up your own mind. But let's not stretch this prelude longer than it needs to be. Here are the 3 flavors of video game horror in 2023. Amnesia the Bunker's very first playthrough can be truly exhilarating. The short introduction into the game makes you aware of how oppressive this truly horrifying World War I setting is. Add to that the realization of being trapped in the guts of a concrete labyrinthine monstrosity being absolutely pummeled by heavy artillery, with extremely limited supplies and a generator that loves to run out in the most inconvenient of times so that it can leave you in almost completely impenetrable darkness. Oh, and we can't forget about the main reason behind why your trek through these dark corridors can seem so harrowing and agonizingly stressful. The Stalker. A creature completely different to what previous frictional games titles have accustomed us to. An adversary that will not disappear after your first encounter, and will continue to make your life an absolute nightmare in almost every corner of this underground locality. And believe me when I say this, the very first instance of hiding from this twisted aberration after the generator has run out of fuel yet again, then subsequently crouch-walking the whole way back to the single truly safe place in the entirety of the game, raised my heart rate by a dangerous amount, making my mind imagine terrible, unearthly things in the inky, black spaces on my monitor where previously the dimly lit corridors of the bunker used to be. You're probably not going to be able to imagine how that felt just by looking at your screen right now, since both OBS's and YouTube's compression has most likely filled these dark spots with artifacts and overall nasty blockiness. But the point stands. The very first 30 minutes or so of Amnesia the Bunker made me sweat like no other game in the series ever did. However, after those 30 minutes have already passed, I started to see the seams of the game's design expose themselves to me. And with each deadly encounter with the Stalker, the tension I felt turned into frustration. Amnesia the Bunker, in its essence, appears to be more of a proof of concept project than an actual game. Or maybe it could have been Frictional's response to the allegations of growing soft with each subsequent title. Let's remember that both Soma and Rebirth have often been categorized as walking sims more so than horror games they attempted to be, because of the almost absolute lack of consequences when messing up a particular section, as well as the fact that each one of these has been updated with a so-called safe mode that makes the dangerous parts of these experiences completely negligible. Deciding if this addition to these games is a good choice truly only depends on where you fall in the whole obligatory easy mode debacle, but that discussion is its own can of worms for a different time. However, the part of Amnesia the Bunker that made me feel like it's more of an experiment than an actual game is the fact that the game is built up around the fragility of the protagonist character being accentuated not by the sanity systems of old, this mechanic has been removed from this entry to the series completely, but rather the game actually demanding you to stay away from danger, abandoning any sort of a checkpoint system and forcing you to use a single, manual, save point in your singular save room. This immediately felt like a huge departure from what previous Amnesia titles have attempted to achieve, and reminded me more of a resource management heavy titles from series like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. And as brilliant as the idea of combining the classic, more stealth and exploration based gameplay of Amnesia games with elements of survival horror and a stalker nemesis mechanic seemingly taken out straight from Alien Isolation seems on paper, it's very clear that Frictional is very new to this style of video game design, which ends up affecting many parts of the gameplay loop negatively. As much as I enjoyed scouring through these abandoned hallways and rooms of each of the bunker's subsections, the extremely short amounts of time where I was relatively safe to try and look into every corner of each one of these in search of items I needed to actually progress further into the game, combined with the fact of how limiting the oil lamp saving system was, pulled me out of the atmosphere of the survival horror experience because of how tiresome that mechanic could get after a while. The fact that the monster liked to randomly roam through areas right next to my character's position for what seemed like an eternity before going back into its hidey hole on each one of my attempts caused me to crouch walk everywhere just in case it could mess up my plans. This ironically ended up making the impending power cutouts even more annoying the more I played, turning each return to the safe room into an annoying slog. At least if I would make an actual attempt to play by the game's rules, that is. You see, what I ended up doing is that after I initially explored each location, I stopped caring all that much about making a return back to my base of operations, and in some cases I managed to trigger the monster to come out and usually obliterate me. On reload, I sprinted straight from the room to each location with a key item or a fuel can, and then ran back to the safe room. This approach, combined with the fragile nature of the player's character, caused me to usually ignore most of the healing items I'd found because not only is the healing animation painfully slow, I usually was able to make it back to the safe room without getting any damage. Unless I forgot to clear out some of the rats that were blocking one of the more critical paths through one of the subsections. And yes, you could argue that the randomized and more organic way in which your foe seems to pursue after you is what introduces the most tension to your playthrough. However, after the 20th time you get one-shotted by that thing while trying to find that damn main quest item, key to your progress, you're not even truly scared anymore. You're just tired of having to run back to your safe room all the damn time. At times, the behavior of the stalker did remind me of the time I played Alien Isolation, and it's clear that some of the instances of the monster appearing out of nowhere are not caused by you interacting with some sort of a trigger, but simply happening onto a scripted event, like his appearance in the church right after you find that damn pillory key. On that note, I must admit that the sometimes lacking yet extremely persistent AI of the monster did not end up infuriating me as much as some of the xenomorph encounters from Creative Assembly's title. Since a single playthrough of Amnesia the Bunker can probably last up to 4 or maybe 5 hours, in contrast to the 15 to 20 hour campaign of Isolation, that most can agree was way too long for what it actually offered. But let's come back to the fact that the monster is able to one-shot you no matter the difficulty setting. This might seem like a huge hurdle, especially to players that get really anxious with horror titles. However, that design decision is not as much of a problem as you might think at first. Since the locations of items are hard-coded into your current playthrough of Amnesia the Bunker, and dying turns into an event similar to failing at stealth in most Amnesia games, where it's hardly consequential. While true that it does impede on your progress in contrast to those older titles, it does so in a way that mostly forces you into giving up the last slivers of immersion for a more effective speedrun-like approach to the game. One of the mechanics that is supposedly designed to trample your attempts is the fact that dog tags with codes you need for the mission storage room lockers that contain some of the most important items to get in the game are different on each playthrough, and they need to be physically turned around for your character to note them down in their journal. Just like in the case of the number and kind of items on each run, these stay exactly the same throughout your current playthrough. So if you remember them, or let's be honest, just write them down in your phone, it makes it so you don't have to be even all that worried about the monster getting you or having to again deal with packs of rats usually chewing up on most bodies that contain these mission-critical items, because you can just beeline it to the spot where you're supposed to use that code. Because of this semi-randomized nature of the location of most usable items on each of the playthroughs you start, excluding most of the tools that are necessary to progress through some of the subsections of the bunker, you could argue that Amnesia the Bunker is a game that is designed around replayability. Some even call it a sort of survival horror roguelite, and the developers at Frictional would certainly love if gamers would treat this game as such. Unfortunately, after playing through the game at all 3 difficulties, I can tell you straight up that the actual replayability factor of the bunker is extremely low. While it's true that easy mode gives you way more items to play with and even allows you to create a situation where the bunker lights never actually go off, and hard mode essentially does the 180-degree opposite of that, where your resources are scarce and the stalker is even more aggressive than usual, in any of those cases the experience is basically unchanged. Some of the keys might switch places, some fuel cans might not be in the usual spot, or not there at all. Codes might differ, and rats might be located in more or less annoying ways than on your previous playthroughs. But the essential core of the experience is always the same: to better your time score again and again and again and again. The element of Amnesia the Bunker that certainly does not necessitate a second playthrough is the game's story. In short, there isn't much there. You play as
Henri Clément,
a French soldier fighting in the Battle of Somme during the First World War, and after experiencing a short set of almost randomly cut-together sequences taking place in the trenches, including a skirmish with the German troops, an attempt at saving your friend Lambert from a huge sinking hole, and subsequently losing your consciousness after getting hit with what I can assume was a mortar shell, you are greeted with the actual opening screen of the game informing you that the bunker is not what the series accustomed us to throughout the years. And after playing through a short sequence of waking up in the infirmary and getting through some of the basics of the rules of surviving in this place, you are free to explore the bunker and discover what happened to all the other soldiers. Why is there a monster lurking in the shadows? And how to escape from this horrid concrete labyrinth. So from that point on, it falls to the player to want to discover all of the details of the plot of the game through a series of journal entries and notes spread all over the bunker. But what you eventually discover is hardly even shocking to a seasoned Amnesia player. There are obvious connections to the wider lore of the previous games, especially Rebirth, but the main twist of the game and the ending itself are as predictable as you could imagine. More so because the unsubtle hints at the identity of the monstrosity chasing you through the bunker are placed in basically all of the pieces of text you get to read throughout the game. It's the weakest story I have yet seen coming from frictionalgames' writing team, which is doubly disappointing considering how good and well thought out some of the stories they've told in the past were. I'm looking at you, Soma, you existential dread-inducing piece of art. At this point, you might be scratching your head thinking, why did I even include Amnesia the Bunker in this video when all I keep talking about is the faults and shortcomings of this title? The reason for that is rather simple. Even though Amnesia the Bunker feels like an undercooked passion project more than a finished game in some aspects, the audacity of Frictional to try something new here is what makes it impossible for me to not appreciate their efforts. Dev team themselves described Amnesia the Bunker as a horror immersive sim of sorts, and while I don't think that sort of a description is 100% accurate, there is something to it. There are multiple occasions where the bunker makes the choice to leave it completely up to you how to solve a given problem. I mean, this is the first Amnesia game that actually includes usable guns and allows you to try your luck and shoot your monstrous opponent dead. And while that's impossible during 99.9% of your playthrough and your guns only allow you to temporarily scare away the monster or kill a rat or two standing in your way, these weapons have more utility than just killing things. You can break padlocks with them, you can break down doors, or you can even use them as sort of a lure for the beast while you prepare a powder keg to block the beast in its path, making it destroy it, which results in an explosion that also scares it away for a while. There are plenty more examples of these truly organic use cases of all of the tools you are given the option to play with, some of which I probably haven't even discovered during my time with the game. It's also quite incredible to me how well the physics system from previous Amnesia games integrates with this more open approach that Frictional has chosen for the bunker, causing you to be able to sometimes come up with solutions that are certainly not originally intended by the developer. Amnesia the Bunker had the potential to be the most tense experience that I've ever had while playing a frictional games title. And while it did not manage to excel at that aspect after the initial 30 minutes of playing the game, what made me eventually stick all the way through to the end credits of the game is the fact that while imperfect in many aspects, Amnesia the Bunker makes some of the most interesting design and gameplay choices in this series yet. I truly hope that most of the issues I described in this segment are just growing pains of the newfound potential of Frictional to start excelling at creating truly organic and more involved experiences in the future, with hopefully better written stories at the level of depth that the next game in this video represents. To nobody's surprise, I'm a person that has a lot of phobias. I've been afraid of heights since I can remember. I squirm at anything even remotely close-looking to a slug, and for years I had an extremely tough time trusting most dogs. You get the point. However, one of my fears has been harder for me to put into words for the longest of times. The closest way I could describe it is a kind of a phobia of losing my personal freedom, or of being forced into a situation that I have no interest being forced into, meanwhile not being able to take any meaningful action against it. What I mean is, while I'm not a claustrophobic person, I'm absolutely terrified of the idea of incarceration. of being forced to stay in a tiny, locked space for years, maybe even decades, having to suffer through whatever ordeal the ones imprisoning me have intended. It's the idea of the ultimate disempowerment, making you into something that can't be truly considered human anymore, just an object in the hands of whoever keeps you locked up. Decarnation does feed into that fear, presenting you, and this is a bit of a spoiler, the story of a woman abducted and imprisoned against her will in a cellar of somebody's home. It's not only one of the most uncomfortable and harrowing video game horror stories I had the opportunity to experience, but also an excellent dissection of what I can only assume is an attempt at capturing the process of a captive slowly going into Stockholm Syndrome, as well as an introversive tale of discovering the nature of your true self while at your lowest point possible, while behind literal bars of steel. But let's talk about the basics first. Decarnation by
Atelier QDB.
On the surface level might look like one of your cookie-cutter, RPG Maker-based horror-tinged experiences, sporting a semi-pixel art aesthetic and simplistic gameplay mainly consisting of walking around, interacting with objects and puzzles, and some very light stealth sections, with a healthy dose of quick-time events sprinkled all over the game for some sense of variety. However, these elements of the game are built around the idea of being used as a storytelling device more than actual gameplay mechanics. Most of the QTEs you encounter represent some sort of a physical action your character needs to take, and most of the puzzles in the game are in some ways representative of the story beat that currently underscores them. The game also makes use of some truly creative transitioning techniques, where a scene can almost seamlessly transition into another one, both signifying passage of time, as well as the fluid nature of how the main character's mind perceives the world around her, as well as it plays around with maximizing the screen real estate that it uses, constraining you to a small sliver of pixels in the middle of your screen at some points, and filling your monitor with a spectacular and imaginative scene in the other. This seeming simplicity of Decarnation's gameplay, however, it must be said that one pillar-jumping QTE sequence can absolutely go fuck itself, ends up only serving the excellent storytelling of Atelier QDB's creation, and allows the heavy and somewhat disturbing tone of the story to set in and play the main role in enthralling the player into the world of the game. The action of the game starts in the year 1989 in the city of Paris, where our protagonist, Gloria, a famous cabaret dancer, is modeling for the sculptor Petrus. Even from that very early point in the game's story, there is this very clear notion that things aren't going exactly our protagonist's way. The sculptor even makes remarks on Gloria's 29 years of age physique, being at the last point in time where she has the body that can actually serve as a blueprint for his sculpture. And that rude sexist remark is a sign of other things in Gloria's life coming crushing down in the next few months. Not only does her partner, Joy, break up with her, and her cabaret boss, Aldo, tells her that he plans to move her to a coach position instead of a regular dancer, which her cold and clearly quite distant mother, Victoria, seemed to almost predict. But also there's this one event that leaves a scar on her psyche that cuts way deeper. When visiting a museum that is supposed to display the finished sculpture of her body, she encounters a weird man who can be seen seemingly groping the body of the statue in ways that could be considered inappropriate, possibly even abusive towards the model when considering the context of the situation. That event leads to the first instance of the player immersing themselves into the inner nightmarish world of Gloria's psyche that most of the playthrough is spent in. It's a twisted version of real places you previously traversed through in the real world, embodying all of the fears and struggles that the protagonist has to contend with. It's filled with all sorts of contorted, fleshy beings being reflections of either Gloria or other people that had the most impact on her life, or at least her life in this current point of time. This introversive journey inside of her head, as well as her current life situation, leads her to taking up an offer that was too good to be true to begin with, and leads straight into her abductor's hands. While trying to meet a so-called Mr. Saint Louis in the clearly sketchy parts of the Boulogne woods, she gets shot with a sleeping dart, and so begins the main body of the game's story. Gloria being abducted and held prisoner by a so-called master, and his faithful yet painfully meek and subservient servant Bob. Since I want to limit the amount of what I spoil of the rest of the game's plot from this point on, I would like to dive into what makes Decarnation's flavor of horror so disturbingly fascinating. It's mostly because Decarnation gets only more and more discomforting as it goes on, just by the virtue of the fact that, just like the protagonist, we realize that we can get used to this prison. The initial horror of the situation that Gloria found herself in slowly turns into a sad, yet depressingly acceptable state of reality. And as much as Gloria despises her captors, she does warm up to Bob and his cooking skills. That also does play into the aforementioned, clearly visible, developing Stockholm Syndrome of Gloria. She starts to justify the actions of her abductors mainly by the merit of the amount of time she has spent in that quote-unquote cage of hers, but also because she actually tries to humanize one of her captors. Partially to get a chance at running away, but also to maintain some sort of a human connection in her horrid situation. Something that is actually understandable, no matter how much it might repulse you as an idea from an onlooker's perspective. However, what made Decarnation click for me personally was how well this part of the narrative was tied to Gloria's journey into the different parts of her subconscious, that at first felt disorganized and chaotic, just like the initial state she finds herself in while in captivity, to then become thematic reflections of her journey of self-discovery, where she interacts with what I could assume are the echoes of her own childhood, her imagined senile and wiser self, as well as different parts of her psyche that represent the elements of her nature that she does not yet accept. Funnily enough, the nightmarish version of Paris we traverse through also starts to feel familiar after a while. It's mainly due to the weight of the situation in the real world beginning to crush the glimmers of hope the main character still feels. However, the only method to find strength needed to fight against it can only be found by venturing deeper and deeper into Gloria's mind. A realm where even the most horrifying monstrosities are truthfully nothing compared to the situation that this woman found herself in the real world. Decarnation, in a way, feels like the exact opposite of what Amnesia the Bunker tried to achieve with its design goals, where the bunker embraced experimental, immersive sim-like elements and introduced them into the classic Amnesia stealth exploration formula, creating a complex concoction that produced a game with initially enthralling gameplay loop, with only absolute scraps of not-so-great storytelling being interspersed throughout. Decarnation, on the other hand, fully embraces an approach that is closer in fashion to a Telltale game or maybe even a visual novel, more so than a classic RPG Maker-like horror experience it tries to kind of replicate or pay an homage to. And that is what ends up being its biggest strength, being a game that is focused mostly on a horribly disturbing yet deeply intriguing tale of one's growth through strife. A A lot of words have already been said or written about Dredge. The cozy yet Lovecraftian fishing semi-simulator has proven yet again that an indie game with a concept fresh and well executed enough will find its audience. And in the case of Dredge, that's exactly what happened. But how? Let me ask you this. When was the last time you were excited by a fishing minigame? We have had these for seemingly forever in all manner of RPGs, MMOs, and survival games, but it always seemed like an activity that was mostly appreciated by an avid and very vocal minority of gamers out there. But what if I told you that Dredge is a game that kinda made me an actual convert? How did it do that, you ask? Well, when did you see this happen in a game focused on catching a plethora of sea critters? You see, Dredge might be a game about steering a boat from one fishing minigame to another, but it's actually kind of a fishing survival horror game. Well, alright, that might be pushing the term of survival horror a bit too much even for this video, since Dredge is a rather relaxed experience without huge spikes in terms of difficulty and a health system that isn't all that punishing to even the clumsiest of players. However, the horror aspects are certainly there. By that, I do not want to try and fool you into thinking that Dredge is as tension-inducing as Amnesia the Bunker that I covered earlier today, or more tension-inducing than any other more standard kind of an actual horror experience. But it certainly tingles the specific part of my brain that has always been equally fascinated and terrified by what lurks in the depths of our oceans. You could possibly call it a light case of thalassophobia, a term that seems to be making the rounds in the widely understood gaming community after the release of Iron Lung. Dredge makes full use of that sort of fear, while intermingling it with elements pulled almost straight out of Lovecraft's stories, filling the game's world with dangers that do not adhere to logical explanations. They are all tied to the central mechanic that impedes the speed at which you can explore the world that Black Salt Games has crafted. Simply put, getting overly stressed while out dredging about leads to very spooky results. The similarities to insanity meters of games like The Dark Corners of the Earth, Eternal Darkness, and of course Amnesia are numerous. But the developers find a way to make that mechanic play into the larger picture of the gameplay loop rather than just use it to make the player more tense. Since becoming overstressed means that the game will start to fuck with you, the screen will start to blur, flocks of red-eyed birds will snag your catch, and underwater tendrils will try to destroy your boat out of nowhere. And that's only during the day. Since Dredge includes a full-on day and night cycle as well as a dynamic weather system, the game shows its cosmic horror roots even more after the sun hides behind the horizon. It's then when big sea monsters will come out to the surface to get you, some of them clearly visible from afar, but others pretending to be ships while away from you, and others not existing at all, and being only a figment of your stressed out mind. That's also when the light and visibility mechanic comes into play, where some elements of the environment can be obstructed from your vision if you're not close enough to them, making for a nice organic jump scare of sorts if you do not learn the layout of the cliffs surrounding different harbors you travel between. Dredge might not be a heart-pumping experience in the vein of Outlast, and its aesthetics are as far as you can get from the disturbing imagery of something like Scorn. However, the mysterious tone of the game and its story, combined with the simple yet effective terror felt when encountering misshapen inhabitants of the deepest depths of the archipelago's waters, work wonders for your imagination. Never truly overbearing your senses, but giving you that itch on the back of your head, making you expect something to lurch out of the water at any point, even when you're completely safe, surrounded by calm seas and interacting with a host of quirky characters. If I had to imagine how the idea for Dredge even came to be, I would imagine it as a result of a heavily chemically stimulated brainstorming sesh that ended with participants having an epiphany about making a Lovecraftian seafaring game with the core fishing loop added into the mix when the herbs started wearing off and somebody just yelled, "But what the hell are you even supposed to do in this game?" But let's leave my poor attempts at writing something humorous behind and let's get to the exact reason why I feel Dredge works so well in terms of its horror aspects. It's the simple fact that Dredge, whenever it isn't trying to spook you, is actually a very competently made game, with a gameplay loop that, even when removed from the Lovecraftian context, is really fucking fun. Traversing through the sea waters between different parts of this fictitious archipelago that the game takes place at is an experience directly affected by how much care you put into maintaining your ship. Fishing as an activity has an actual financial incentive to it and allows you to upgrade and fix your ship, as well as add additional parts to it to make your fishing even more efficient, or to allow you to pull your catch from the deepest abyssal stretches of the ocean floor. The dredging mechanic you get access to at the beginning of the game allows you to gather resources for the upgrades of your ship, as well as quest items needed for a whole wide cast of characters giving you quests to fulfill, as well as ominous artifacts which you collect for a mysterious collector that grants you power-ups that allow you to travel faster, teleport around the map, or even banish a sea creature trying to sink your boat back to the Shadow Realm. If it's not clear to you yet, Dredge was the most fun I had with all of these three games. And while true, its flavor of horror is not particularly deep nor excessively tension-filled, as well its story, as interesting as it might be, it's nowhere near as layered as the story of Decarnation. But Dredge managed to pull me in completely for the 13 hours it took me to complete it. And looking at how the devs at Black Salt Games are keeping up with their promise of expanding the game with additional features and even more content, I'm excited to dive back into this one-of-a-kind, cozy Lovecraftian fishing game. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through these three different flavors of very indie video game horror in 2023. I know that you might not exactly agree with some things that I said in this video. Well, damn, you might not even consider Dredge to be an actual horror game. However, this unlikely trio of games exploring what this genre can mean in the year of our effervescent flying spaghetti monster lord and savior 2023 is what we severely needed. Amnesia the Bunker, while certainly far from perfect, was a bold experiment that frictional games have dedicated themselves to wholeheartedly. Decarnation was an incredibly unsettling yet very empathetic look into a life of a person turning into living hell that should be experienced by all fans of thoughtful stories in their horror games. Finally, Dredge was simply a real joy to play, be it escaping from the jaws of nightmarish sea beasts or just enjoying your time fishing one aberrant fish after the other. All of these games combined into a wonderful yet terrifying stew made up of flavors that might not necessarily go together, but with a sprinkling of patience and openness towards experiencing something fresh, they make for a splendid video game feast. Confront this with the fact that it seemed that the best things this year had to offer were mainly remade versions of games millions of gamers already loved and knew from page to page, for actual decades now. Don't get me wrong here. I think that both the Dead Space and RE4 remakes are absolutely incredible games. RE4 Remake being so good that it made me deeply reflect upon my initial stance on the original. But, and that's a big but, I already played all of these titles before. It's as simple as that.
Son of a...
Hey there, I see you made it to the very end of this video, and I wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This video represents yet another experimental shift for the channel. However, I do plan to eventually get back to making some of the more standard review videos that I've done in the past. I know my upload schedule wasn't the strictest you ever seen on this platform, but my turbulent life and the fact of trying to actually finish my degree affected that in more ways than one. I'm well aware that I've been gone from YouTube for far longer than I probably should be, and I do aim to change that. I hope you enjoyed your time watching this particular vid, and do please subscribe and click the notification bell and all that good stuff if you want to see more of my stuff in the future. Oh, and before I forget, if you have any interest in the games I covered in this video, I left Steam store links in the description for you so you can check them out yourself. Also, if you want to watch videos dissecting these games that I covered here in much greater detail, I implore you to watch the excellent Ragnarok's video on Decarnation and equally as good VZ Show's video on Dredge. With that said, thanks for watching. Sayonara.
I'm sorry, who is this?
We weren't expecting visitors.
Am I even more beautiful than you? I've been told you're the subject of songs from Ionia to Thebes. No! You can look but you can't touch. You maggots! You do not deserve to behold my divine radiance.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?